Craddock. I am the Director of Imaging at the Child Mind Institute and a Director of the Computational Neuroimaging Lab at the Nathan Klein Institute, both in New York. So the Nathan Klein Institute is a state of New York run psychiatric research institute. And the Child Mind Institute is a child and adolescent psychiatric practice that also has a non-for-profit and a research institute, and I'm a part of that. So some of the research I would like to talk about today is based on an R01 I was lucky enough to receive, where we're looking at real-time fMRI to do neurofeedback of the default network. And mostly this is something that I'm going to be using probatively to be able to test the hypothesis about whether or not individuals can or cannot modulate the network. I'm sure that many of you, if you're in OBTP, maybe were interested more about the training aspect of being able to use this for rehabilitation. I don't know yet. I haven't worked on that yet. It's definitely something I'm interested in. It's definitely something I believe could work, and I have some ideas about that. But we can talk more about it. But just to kind of, yes, the learning is something we're interested in, but haven't kind of got that far yet. Just for some of you who may not know, the default network is a satellite is a group of brain regions that are throughout the brain, but mostly in the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the temporal lobes, the brain regions that are consistently deactivated when you perform externally focused, goal-driven cognition. Right? So we're learning more and more and more about when it is deactivated, but how it was originally discovered was by some people at WashU in Rachel's lab, and they were doing PET images. And the typical way that they were doing these experiments is they would collect a series of PET images while somebody's performing a task, and they would have images while somebody was resting, not performing the task, and they would subtract the two. So task minus rest, and they would get whatever pattern they associated with the activation, right? If you looked at the opposite of that contrast, though, rest minus task, these are areas of the brain that are higher, that are more active when you're not performing the task than when you are performing the task. And what they discovered is that that network is highly consistent no matter what task you perform, right? So they would apparently have a huge file folder that were full of these negative results where they would just one more task, and add them on there that do it. What they found is, and here's an image of what that looks like. It's done in blue for the deactivation, right? The fact that it's across all these different tasks is where the term default comes from. And it's been associated with internalized cognition, right? So autobiographical memory activates it, envisioning the future, theory of mind, making moral decisions, right? Intrinsic thought processes, rumination, mind wandering, anything that you think about right before you're trying to go to bed at night, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the types of things it's been associated with. To deactivate the network, the thing has to be cognitively challenging enough, the task you're performing, right? So if you're doing an M-back, it's deactivated. But if you're doing like a motor tapping, it's probably not deactivated unless it's a complex pattern. If you're doing visual stimuli, it's probably not deactivated. So there are some networks that can be active apparently at the same time as the default network, and others which don't seem to be able to be active at the same time. And those networks seem to be that can't be active at the same time as the default network. They almost have a competitive interrelationship with the default network, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So shortly after kind of this discovery or observation of the default network, Michael Grecius proved that the regions that are the default network that can be identified from these task subtractions are also highly correlated at rest. If you do a resting state analysis here in resting state, if you use a seed region such as the posterior cingulate, extract a time course from that region and correlate it with every other voxel in the brain, you get the default network. That is one of the most robustly found networks across individuals, across species, and across time. So it's definitely there, it's definitely strong, and it's probably one of the easiest things to find. Because of this nature, the resting state scans are easy to give in clinical populations, and this network is so robust, and because people associate the thought processes with the default network with things like mind wandering and rumination, people have been very interested to study it in psychiatric diseases. So a typical analysis that they might do is is the example here, where you take a population of depressed patients, you calculate their resting state default network activity, and you compare that to a control population, and you look at the differences. And here you see Michael Grecius found the subgenual cingulate in the sort of dorsal middle thalamus. So these are areas that, you kind of, what he was hoping to find. I think other people were happy to find it too. But there's obviously a depression signal there. But one of the questions becomes, so when you're measuring the connectivity of the network, you're measuring the architecture of the network. Are all of these regions connected together in the same way between healthy controls and people that are depressed? But one thing that may be difficult, though, is one thing that this doesn't show is the activity patterns of this network. Right? I mean, to me, it's completely likely that someone could have a fully intact default network, but it's just wrong, or it's on at the wrong times, right? And this fits very well with things like the role of the subgenual cingulate in depression, where people don't believe that there's actually something wrong with the area. It just happens to be active when it shouldn't be active, right? So the connectivity of this network may or may not be, has been identified in a lot of different disorders as being different, but even if with intact connectivity, you can have patterns of activation of the network that vary between individuals. And this has actually been shown in the literature a little bit. So this is from Yvette Chaline's paper on depression. And what she's found is that regions of the, so she did this through a task subtraction, right? Where she had a task and she looked at the degree to which brain regions were deactivated by that task. And you see areas of the default network in your healthy control were adequately deactivated. But what she found is for depressed individuals, those areas weren't deactivated by the task, right? And so there's this idea, again, that I mentioned, that the default network is in opposition or is in competition with certain task networks. So there's this idea, well, what happens if the default network doesn't turn off when you should be performing that task, right? That would lead to, some interference between the tasks and maybe a cognitive deficit, such as the things we see with depression, right? What they found is if you actually look at the anti-correlation between quote-unquote task-positive networks, so the activation pattern that's positively associated with your task, and look at how strongly that is anti-correlated with the default network, that is predictive of patient performance, how quickly they respond in a flanker task. So their reaction time gets longer if the two networks are less anti-correlated, right? So if the networks have times when they're on at the same time, your performance gets worse. So the basic idea is that the default network lives in some sort of competition with these other networks. If its balance with those other networks go awry, then that might be a symptom of a variety of different psychiatric disorders. The psychiatric disorders it's currently been linked to are things like ADHD, depression, aging. I guess that's not necessarily a psychiatric disorder, but social anxiety, just across the board, right? It's associated with rumination, it's associated with mind wandering, it's associated with perseverative thought, right? So these are the things it's associated with. One of the things, though, that's kind of interesting is that, well, interesting, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be specific, right? So all of these disorders show a very similar dysregulation of the default network, and we can explain that in terms of their actual pathologies, but it's not specific to that disorder, right? So you may be able to differentiate a healthy control for somebody with depression based on the interference between their default network and their other networks, right? But you wouldn't maybe be able to distinguish somebody from social anxiety disorder from depression, right? So it's very much, to me at least, an interesting dimension of pathology, maybe a symptom that's across a lot of different disorders, and I think there's a lot of value in trying to understand whether or not this phenomenon actually happens, right? Whether or not the default network is interfering with other networks, and whether or not that's leading to the symptoms that are in these disorders. The problem is, it's very hard to do that given existing tools, right? So with the task subtraction technique, you're kind of looking at the average activity of the network in the two conditions and subtracting those. And you can't really differentiate between, kind of this, they're not oppositional from one another, or it's, if they are oppositional, the default network's just less deactivated. There's a lot of things you can't differentiate when you're actually doing those tasks. Also, when you do this in the context of the task, there's also the concern about whether or not you're measuring whether they can deactivate the network or whether they do deactivate the network. And I think that both of those are important for various reasons, but you can't dissociate those. So, for example, in ADHD, there's a lot that have been linking it to motivation, and it could just be that the person doesn't do the task that you ask them to do, not that they can't do the task that you ask them to do, right? And so that's kind of an example of when you would want to differentiate between can and do. And we want to be able to do that, and one way that we want to try to be able to do that is optimize somebody's ability to measure the network, or to modulate the network, and see how well they can, right? So we do that in the context of real-time neurofeedback, right? So specifically, we're tracking the activity of the default network. We're giving the participant feedback on what I call the brainometer. So the needle moves left or right towards the word focused or wandering. Wandering means high default network, focus means low default network. I'm not studying the psychology of the words wandering or focus. I'm studying the mechanism of the default network. We can get into an argument about what mind wandering is if you like. I will lose, I guarantee you. But what we're studying is the activity of this network, and I'm tracking whether or not the network is high or low. In order to explain what that means to a layperson, I'm just saying wandering and focus. Okay, I've obviously had to debate this quite a few times, but just FYI, that always comes up, and yes, sure. Also, I'd like to caveat I'm an engineer, so there's a lot about brains that I probably don't understand as deeply as many of you do. So but the goal is to give people feedback to help them optimize their strategy for doing what we ask them to do, and then see how well they can do it, right? And we want to be able to test the hypothesis of default network dysregulation in depression, ADHD, etc. But also we want to be able to do it across a wide variety of people to try to understand what does this inability to modulate the network mean about somebody? Like, what traits does it confer? Right? So if I know that the default network is interfering, what about their behavior can I explain? Memory lapses probably. How much they ruminate, those have already been shown. But across a wider dimension, what does it mean? So when I talk about real-time tracking of resting state networks, this is what I mean. We have a guy in a tube that's getting an MRI scan. As the imaging data is being collected, it's sent to another computer. Right? So this process starts with a training scan, where we learn information from these scans to be able to decode the activity level of the default network, right? So what we do is we take all of these imaging scans and call this the labels for those scans, but essentially the time course of the default network that we believe is associated with it, and we do our training. And the output from that is a classifier that allows us to decode the activity of that network. You can do this for any network in the brain that you're interested in. Once you have that trained, then you do the testing scan. And at that point, what happens is the images get sent over here. You do extract the time course data, the activity data, and then you feed that back to your stimuli. And then the participant sees that and uses that to modify their strategy or whatever their behavior is. Right? So that's the basic of real-time fMRI. This requires customized software to run on the scanner, but there's a lot of tools that are publicly available to allow you to do the analysis once you get the data off the scanner. The reason why it's harder to get the software that runs on the scanner, for example, my software, is that the Siemens contracts that I have limit. I can't just make it open source, otherwise I would. But they have intellectual property that would be exposed or something like that. For the offline processing, we use AFNI. They have a very good tool for doing this. They probably are the first people to have a tool to do this. Resting state fMRI was essentially defined by Bob Cox, the inventor of AFNI, back in 1995. And he has a lot of optimized algorithms to make it work better. And he envisioned this not only as a way to run neurofeedback experiments, but also as a way to monitor the quality of the data as it's being acquired. So here is an example of that. So this is my head. It's easy to tell because it's so noisy. And I'm just doing left and right motor tapping, right? And the output of these areas, a classifier that differentiates me tapping my right hand versus left hand, is being fed back to this arrow. So I'm tapping my hand and the arrow is moving to the right. I tap the left hand and it moves to the left. You can go back and forth real quick. You can do motor imagery and move it back and forth. Those things work, right? And so this experiment's going on. While it's going on, we're calculating just a standard correlation analysis so that you can see the brain areas that are active. And we see exactly what we hope to see, even in the cerebellum, which I think is cool. And we can look at a Bowles time course for this region and just see what that might look like. It also does motion correction on the data as it's being acquired. And you can see the motion plots over here. So that's our basic interface. We have added software to this to enable our classifier-based approach to being able to decode the network. And so basically, and I guess I will show that in just a minute, right? So the old school fMRI is where you just draw a region of interest, say here, and then get a mean time course like this and feed that back to your arrow stimuli. And usually you would have to do some sort of localization or training in order to be able to identify that region idiosyncratically for the individual you're interested in. We use a classifier-based approach because what that allows us to do is employ very strong hypotheses about the behavior, but no hypotheses about the anatomy. Right? So in order to do track and ROI, you have to know what ROI it should be, right? But for us, we calculate, we train a classifier that's based on somebody who's doing a behavior. So for example, with the left versus right finger tapping, rather than drawing circles around the motor cortex, I did a training scan where I tapped my right hand when I was told to, tapped my left hand when I was told to, and then a classifier was built to be able to distinguish whether you were tapping your left hand versus the right hand. Right? And then the output signal is, kind of how hard you're tapping your left or the right hand once you have that, right? So that's one way that differentiates our approach from just the ROI tracking approach. And so with the ROI tracking, if I was to do the same thing, it would be more about maybe tracking the activity of the posterior cingulate rather than tracking the activity of the entire network. And I think that that's important because if I'm pulling in information from all the regions that are involved, not only am I measuring the level of activity of those regions, but I'm measuring the level of synchrony in those regions, right? So for my classifier to be high, all of the brain areas in the network have to have high activity, but they all also have to be simultaneously high. If one of those areas was, say, not operating with the rest and going negative instead of positive, then that would reduce the score that comes out of it. Yes?
I just want to make sure I understand. So your classifier is making a binary decision as to whether they're in resting state or not?
No. It's a regression, not a classifier, so that's a little bit different. So in this example, I'm kind of moving along, so maybe you're jumping my segue. But for this example, it's making a binary decision, and it's how it's trained, whether you're going left or right. You can also come up from the score that you get and see how large left or large right. Are you familiar with support vector machines?
Yeah.
So the output when you do the dot product and prediction is the distance from the hyperplane. And so we can use that distance from the hyperplane as a dimensional measure that says how far away are you from that, right? That probably doesn't work for every application very well. So I'm not going to argue interpretationally that that's necessarily the most meaningful thing to do, but it seems to work with things like motor tapping. So if you tap faster or harder, then that distance from the hyperplane does seem to be a good indication of how strong it is, right? Observation. For support vector regression, though, no. Actually, what we do is we for the default network, we extend the process to use regression rather than classifiers, right? So now our output, we're actually training it to match labels that are a continuous measure of brain activity, right? So the thing is in order to do that, we need a DMN time series for our labels, and we need our training data. Right? So the problem is, from whence does this come, right? How do you get that? So you need to have a model of the default network, and we do use a spatial model of that network. This is a default network template that was defined in Steve Smith's PNAS paper, where he's looking at the correspondence between resting state and task-based data. So it has a good story to it, so it's a pretty good match of what we believe the default network is. And then we do a spatial regression of this DMN template to the training data, right? And what that does is gives us a time series for that pattern in that data.
And that pattern includes PCC and medial prefrontal areas, and then a deactivation of is that ACC or?
Yeah, so it's kind of the dorsal anterior cingulate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the 3 components of this template that you're using?
No, well, no. This is in the sideshow plane. Those are the 3 components, but it's it's parietal. It's the entire network.
Yeah.
But you're right. Some areas are negative. Some areas are positive. But the thing is each one of these voxel values has a different number in it, and that number is like how important is that voxel to the default network, all in quotes, right? Because that's an interpretation that may change, but that's how we interpret the values that are in this map, and that's based on the statistics that Steve Smith used to make the map, right? So one thing I could do is I could just take and draw ROIs for these regions and then just add all those voxels together, right? That would be a simple way of creating this time course. But we do know that for some reason, some regions seem to be rated higher than others, right? So when we do the spatial regression, you can think of it as a weighted sum of the voxels whose contribution is determined by the strength of the statistic for the voxel belonging to the default network. Right? So ideally, regions like this that are negative, they're slightly negative, so they're going to have a negative influence, but they're going to have a weaker influence. Right? The areas that are real bright in yellow are going to have the strongest positive influence. Right? So these kind of core regions are going to influence it a little bit more than the others. But that's kind of the idea. Is hopefully so this is actually, if y'all are familiar with the dual regression technique, this is identical to dual regression, except that at this level, instead of doing a univariate correlation of every voxel time series with this default network time series, I'm using support vector regression, right? So this is a multivariate regression. So what I'm saying is make an equation, let's calculate weights so that I can add all the voxels together in a single volume and pump out a measure of the default network activity for that volume. And support vector regression is a regularized regression that allows us to efficiently calculate those weights, right? You can't solve this with standard math because you don't have enough equations to. So you have to use a regularization technique in order to do it. Some of those details are not that important, but they are important, but maybe not to what y'all are interested in. But so support vector regression is just the method I used. I'm good with that technique. Other people may think that whatever their favorite regression, it works better, and it may very well. I haven't really evaluated that. But what you end up with is a subject-specific idiosyncratic model of their default network, right? So it might look like this. And what this is it's in a mathematical equation. It's a representation of a mathematical equation. Each one of these voxels has a weight, and I take and multiply that weight against the activity level of the corresponding voxel in a volume that I receive from the, and then I add all the voxels together, which is a dot product, right? So I take, once this is trained, every TR that I receive data, I calculate the dot product between this model and the image I receive, and take the result of that to be a measure, analogous to these measures, of the level of activity of that region.
What's the task that they're doing during this training data?
Rest. That's the beauty of it. So I got some plans with that, right? So yeah, so you tell them, lie quietly, fixate on this plus sign, and don't think about anything. And then I can pull out the default network from that, and then we can track it. So what nice thing is subject compliance is sort of minimally required in order to be able to do the training on this. I don't have to ask them to do a specific task or require that they perform the task correctly in order to be able to do it, as long as they don't move their head that much and stay awake. Actually, those are, I guess that is the definition of them performing that class, but it's sort of more minimal, right? But so what would be cool, so what if you had like the liar network, right? Or some other network that you want to be able to measure from somebody, then you could track the network if you could pull it out from resting state data, or if you had kind of a really good hypothesis of what the spatial pattern should look like, and you could pull it out of resting state data, then you could do something like train a lie detector system on somebody totally covertly, right? So most lie detector tasks that they do out there, one of the criticisms against it is you have to train the classifier on the individual. And in order to do that, you have to say, okay, I want you to lie when you answer these 5 questions and not lie when you answer these 5 questions, and go back and forth. And then I can train a classifier that says, were you lying or not lying? And the thing is if I'm the person that's trying to conceal some information, I would try to minimize the differences between those two, right? Anybody here had lie detectors before? Right? It's a hell of an experience. I had it twice. But anyway, huh?
Were you guilty?
It's not. It's an interrogation technique. It's not a. We go. Yeah. Yes and no. All right. Yes and no. But anyway, so that's kind of the basic idea. But it's totally covert in terms of the task. So we're not asking somebody. We're not inducing mood, for example, and trying to use mood inducement to measure their mood or something like that, which would be more confounded, I believe. Just to give you an idea, we've done the same technique. We did a test-retest where we took two scans, scan A, scan B, both of them were the same length, and we used our technique to do the training of the classifier on the left scan, and then used it to extract the default network activity on the right, and then reverse the roles of the left and the right, and then we're able to measure the reproducibility of the performance of the technique that way. So it's essentially if you take the left scan to train a classifier and apply it to the right, and then do the vice versa, and look at the outputs and how consistent the outputs are based on what you expect them to be. And then that way we could tell how things are going. And then I did that across 10 different resting state networks that Steve Smith identified from a meta-analysis of both resting state data and task data. And you can see we could actually do really well with the different terms of prediction with actually decoding the data. So these are the different networks. They kind of cluster here where you have, I believe that's cerebellar networks, and then in here you have your actual high-order cognitive networks, which kind of have middle range, and then up here you have all your sensory networks, which seem to have it. So if y'all are kind of into Mesolam and his functional hierarchy, you can kind of see that pulling out in terms of hopefully maybe the stability of these networks are related to your ability to predict it. But regardless of all of that, but things that I don't understand that well, the point of the matter is our prediction accuracy is above 0.8 for all of these networks. So we can do this well, right? And we can track any of these. So if you're interested in motor, if you're interested in visual, you can do that. In order to look at the amount of training data we need, I broke up the training data into between 1 minute all the way up to 10 minute in increments to see how much data we need. It looks like we actually kind of hit a knee around 5 minutes, but you can do really well with 1 minute of training data, right? So if you were dealing with a hyperkinetic population, maybe a stroke population or something like that, you could maybe give a 5-minute scan and pull out the 2 minutes, consecutive 2 minutes that seem to do the best, right? Or something like that. But anyway, so you have some freedom with this. So this method kind of works pretty well for training these classifiers. One of the issues, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I want you to kind of appreciate the complexity of this. In order to be able to do what we're doing, you have to do a lot of image pre-processing online in real time, right? So you have to do things like you have to calculate transforms between your templates and your data in order to get the default network template to match your subject data. You have to do online motion correction and things like that in order to be able to do this. So how we get that processing done is we spend a lot of time figuring out how to optimize these algorithms to make them run as fast as possible so we don't have delays. But also in our acquisition, we hide processing behind acquisition. So for example, we can start our processing once we acquire our anatomical, right? And while we're doing the anatomical, what we want to do, once we've done pre-processing this, which requires image segmentation and calculating the transformed M&I space, we want to be able to start co-registering our Fmri data to it, right? So what we do is we do a quick mask acquisition, which is 4 EPI volumes. So it gives us the EPI space, but we don't have to wait for all of our resting state to be finished to use it. So and then we start calculating our transforms based on that. And then the goal is all of those things are done once this 6-minute training scan is finished. And then we quickly, it takes about a minute to train our classifier after that, and then we're good to go with the other things. So if anybody here studies resting state, they'll know that there's tons of pre-processing steps that have to be done in order to make things work. I kind of learned it the backwards way. I always tend to learn things backwards. But coming from resting state pre-processing, I knew that a lot of stuff had to be done, but I decided to kind of go raw dog and see how much could be done without having to without doing it. And so when I did my first experiment with this, I had 2 brilliant ideas. One of them is we'll minimize the pre-processing, that way we won't have to deal with complexity. And the other is a lot of the instructions that seem to work really well with default network regulation are meditation and mindfulness techniques. So I'll just get all of my participants when they're focusing to focus on their breathing. And that caused large oxygenation change levels in there. I had people that were doing phenomenal at the task. It was like amazing. I was like, yes, Nobel Prize, you know. And then I realized that by changing their breathing, they were actually changing the results. And if you remove the global signal changes due to their breathing, they did good still, but not as good. So it's very important to actually remove these potential sources of nuisance, such as global effect changes due to respiration and other things. Head motion is another one, task-correlated head motion. And because it's neurofeedback, you're actually encouraging them, training them to do the things that you don't necessarily want them to do, right? So if they notice that by holding their breath or breathing slower or breathing deeper helps them perform the task more, you're training them to do that every time now, right? And so we want to try to avoid that as well. So it is very important that we do this. So I added these to AFNI. And the quality of these is pretty good, and they don't introduce very much of a delay, maybe 5 milliseconds of delay to it, right? So here's an actual example of somebody performing the task. So you'll see we have the brainometer. Wandering means high default network. Focus means low default network. In the beginning, we just have kind of an acquiescence period, let the user get used to it. And then in the middle of the screen, we give them an instruction of what we'd like for them to do. So what we'll see is, at least initially, people kind of have some issue getting this thing to work. And if you think about it, you actually kind of have a little bit of a double task thing going, right? Because it's like, look at the neurofeedback display and let your mind wander. So focus, fixate, but don't focus, you know? So eventually, in the beginning, you have a little bit more trouble, but eventually you kind of learn to see the feedback, but not to sort of, I don't know, get too into it. I don't know exactly how to say it. It's kind of like being Jedi, you know. You just you see it without seeing it. But eventually people end up doing quite well, being able to do it. And then at some point they get tired and they have trouble. So our training scan, our scan where we do the active feedback are 13 minutes long. So you can imagine they do get a little bit tired towards the end. In the beginning, though, we had runs. We had several 4-minute runs, and people said that once they exactly got to the point where they felt like they could do it, then we would stop and change it on them. So that was frustrating. So we do it this way.
Okay, wait, you do one 13-minute run, or how many?
One 13. So right now we're doing a 13-minute. So there's 2 tasks.
Yeah.
So one's a 13-minute feedback, and the other's a 13-minute no feedback.
Like a transfer run?
Yeah.
To see how much they can do?
Sure. Well, as a control, to see if the neurofeedback's actually doing anything, but actually as a transfer run too.
Okay.
But so the no feedback is identically, essentially looking at that. So the instruction changes, but the needle doesn't move to follow their feedback. So we did, in a population of about 14 people, the results I'm showing today, we had them come in, they would do the resting state, and then they would do a feedback and a no feedback run. The no feedback and feedback would counterbalance across individuals. Focus versus wander on left and right would counterbalance. All the different counterbalancings we did do. So here's just kind of an example of if it worked. Yes?
Just to understand. So that first 6 minutes, you're getting the template for the person, and then you use that template, and the degree to which their ongoing brain activity matches that template equals focus. The magnitude of that kind of correlation, and the degree to which it's anti-correlated with that equals wandering. Is that right?
Well, you got it exactly opposite, but yeah, vice versa, but yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So here gives you an example of what it looks like when people perform this task. On the top is the best participant we had up to this date, and on the bottom is the worst participant. So you can see from the spatial pattern that both of them, their pattern canonically matches the default network. So what we expect. So we believe we are tracking the right parts of the brain on both of these individuals. You can see for the best subject, in the beginning they have a little bit of trouble, but then they actually begin to match it very well, right? Some other things that we'll notice, though, is there's kind of a lot of high-frequency stuff going on. That may be actually very informative. We haven't fully started investigating that, but we do plan to look and see how that's meaningful. We haven't had anybody that could do things like smoothly follow it yet. So, maybe that's the kind of thing we can aspire to. And you see the worst subject really didn't seem to really get it moving either way, and there was huge motion spikes in the middle that we believe kind of affected their ability to do it.
What's the meaning of the amplitude of the black kind of?
This is the boxcar convolved with an HRF, and then the magnitude I rescaled just so that the images are, just so that it's the scale is appropriate. I rescaled it based on like the variance of this signal, so that you could see everything and it wouldn't be wonky, right? But it isn't significant. Just the direction matters in terms of, if it's up here, then we've asked you to wander. If it's down here, we've asked you to focus. And it shifted a little bit to adjust for the hemodynamic delay. So we did this again, as I said, I believe across 13 participants. And here I've plotted their abilities to do it. So the one thing you see is for the majority of the participants, they were able to do it above chance, the red line's chance, at least for one of their scans, right? I was at Virginia Tech at the time. That explains the colors. But so the darker color here is feedback, and the orange is no feedback. And you'll see that the bars are ordered based on the order in which they received those scans. So these individuals received no feedback before they received feedback. These individuals feedback before no feedback. What we can see is that people kind of tended to perform better on the feedback, and sometimes they actually outperformed on the no feedback scan. But those consistently come when no feedback was second, right? So most often, if feedback was first, then they performed better on the no feedback. You do have one outlier on that, and I guess the feedback got that person in trouble. And what you can see is there is a difference. There is a bit of a difference in the accuracy. There was a lot of variance here, but there is a difference between their performance on the feedback and no feedback scan. A significant difference, but the most is we see there's also a scan number effect, right? Where if you perform the no feedback scan second, you seem to do better than if you did it first. So we do believe that we are seeing some sort of transference. In terms of learning theory, again, my expertise is not really there, but I do believe that people are effectively using the feedback scan to optimize the strategy that they apply. Now, I will say a little bit about what I think for treatment here. So I do think that this at least gives us an inkling that maybe some sort of treatment would work, but I don't think that it would be appropriate or smart, correct, the right way to do it, to train somebody to do something in the scanner. It'd be very expensive if you did it. But I do think for example, for for like perseverative thought, right? Somebody might be instructed to use but it's like mindfulness meditation. There we go. In order to be able to control their thoughts. And if that person isn't particularly interceptive, they may not be able to determine whether or not a specific technique is working for them. So this would give them an objective measure that they could use to optimize, for example, their technique for mindfulness, and then be able to practice that outside of the scanner and maybe come back and do it. So the ultimate goal, I think, is not that it's going to necessarily improve your ability to train people. Hopefully, though, it'll improve the learning curve. It'll make it a faster learning. So ultimately, how I want to be able to use this is to try to look at individual variability between individuals and see if this explains anything. Yes?
Just one thing. How did you define accuracy when there's no feedback?
We tell them what we want them to do. So the accuracy scores that you saw are the correlation between the task and what they actually did. Right? So those are correlation coefficients, right? So when there was no feedback, we asked them to focus and to let their mind wander, focus and wander, but we didn't show them how well they were doing. So we do a standard GLM. And see, behaviorally, we see that the actual performance, so all of these, so the things like the BDI, all of these are in a non-pathological range. So these are not depressed people or anxious people, as far as we know. Maybe a little bit anxious, but not overly anxious. But anyway, we see that the actual performance, as we measure their ability to regulate their default network, is highly correlated with things like their affect intensity measure and their imaginal processes, the SIPPy's imaginal processes inventory. So how much they daydream, right? So the more you daydream, the better you regulate the network, right? Which is interesting. And actually the rumination scale, the more people ruminate, the better they seem to actually regulate the network when we ask them to, right? So it's kind of interesting. Again, I would like to reemphasize. So these people are not pathological. And so what I think that this means is if you ask somebody to mind wander, I mean, one of the things that we've been taught since second grade, since 2 years old, whatever, young, depends on when you started second grade, but is not to mind wander. Put on your concentration cap and do those things, right? And so asking somebody to kind of move into it and move in and out of kind of a mind wandering state, maybe not everybody could do that well. But if you're a bus commuter like I am, and you could just sit down and an instant later be, hanging out in Fiji with a beer in your hand, then then maybe you could actually do that well. And I think that's actually what we're seeing with like the imaginal processes, is that they can activate the network more easily. And then the question is going to become, when we do it in pathological individuals, is there a problem with deactivating the network rather than activating? So that's another aspect is, are you doing what we've asked you to do, but do you tend to do it better when we tell you to turn it down or when we tell you to turn it up? And that, I think, is another going to be important thing.
Do you know in pathological groups if they have problems with any of these behavioral things like rumination and...
So this is a battery that was chosen for depression.
Okay.
So higher rumination on this scale, the RS, the response style inventory, is associated with depression. Affect intensity, we were just wondering, well, if you kind of have flat affect, then maybe you're not the right type of person to think to include in that. So that was more of just a question to kind of deal with maybe possible confounds of affective intensity across the population. BDI is a assessment of depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, and the higher your score is, the more depressed you are. None of these people hit a significant threshold. Whether or not it is a good dimensional measure of depression in non-depressed people is not clear. So it's not necessarily a good dimensional measure of depression. I don't know if there is a good dimensional measure of depression that works outside of people being depressed, right? I think with the Hamilton, it's not really well validated for people that are not currently diagnosed with depression. Anyway, it's what we used. And then so really what our primary outcomes were rumination and SIPI with this analysis. So we kind of threw them all in there to look at. But yeah, definitely mind wandering. The more you mind wander, we would expect it to affect it. But it's kind of interesting because there's another aspect of this that is back to the kind of the can versus do, right? And it's sort of like what do you do, So like with the people with the SIPI things, maybe they actually can do some of the modulation better because it's something that they exercise. So I think in some ways what we're seeing doesn't exactly meet our expectations, where you would see this like, you kind of have, if somebody's pathological, then they can't modulate the network, right? So with rumination, you would think, well, if it's you might expect the exact opposite correlation, where it's like, okay, only the people that can't modulate very well should have higher rumination because they have, this runaway train of negative thought that's preventing them from doing anything other than default network, right? And that might be true in somebody that's suffering from depression. But for somebody who's not suffering depression, they may ruminate a lot and they may be able to turn it off when necessary.
Okay, one more question, just as a follow-up. Within each of these scales, can you say if they're driven, like these correlations are driven more by a better ability to mind wander or a better ability to focus?
Not yet, but we can, and that's one of the things we're going to be looking at. And that's what I was saying earlier, is I do think that that's what you'll see, and I think that the pathology is actually going to be in that differentiation, right? Where you see something like, because that's really the hypothesis that underlies depression. Runaway train of negative thought that you can't turn off. Right, and that matches well with everybody's descriptions of depression, right? There's more than once where I've heard somebody that's like, just said, I don't know why they can't just stop thinking that way. It's like she gets anxious and freaks out, and then why doesn't she just stop thinking about, whatever problem may exist? Well, that could be the pathology, right? So you lack the biological switch that allows you to turn off or suppress the default network, right? So we don't see that in any of this data, but it could hopefully be out there. We're just happy we got it to work. You see the correlates at this point, right? So all of this data that's a part of this research and the ongoing R01 I have. So this was a pilot data I did as part of an RSI Young Investigator Award to study depression. I've since gotten an R01 in order to be able to study this dimensionally across a large population of 25 to 40-year-olds. And so when I say dimensionally, we do 2-day assessments on them. We do, psychiatric interviews as well as full neurocog makeup. We do IQ tests on them and working memory tests. We do VO2. We put them on a bicycle and get them to ride the bicycle for a while, measure their heart rates. We do blood draws, so we have genetic material, so eventually we could have genetics on them. And then the goal is sort of in the high dimensional space to look for relationships between kind of profiles from these assessments and their ability to modulate. And then hopefully we can come up with a better understanding of what able versus unable to modulate, and more specifically, ability to turn off versus ability to turn down and how they relate to those things. So that's an R01, and the data is currently being shared for that through the Rockland sample, the NKI enhanced Rockland sample. So right now we have about 60 subjects up there, and we're going to be adding more. And they have a full, all the assessment data, they have one full day of scanning that is resting stage structural DTI, and then a second day of scanning, which involves this task. So use my data. And then, of course, I couldn't have done this without the collaboration of a lot of different individuals, both at previous institutions and the current institutions. And it was paid for by these organizations. So thank you very much. I believe we have a little bit of time for questions. Yes.
So it's kind of a short amount of training that they have inside the scanner, which makes sense given the practical constraints. But I'm wondering if you had the chance to try it out with anybody, even yourself, on a longer term, several sessions to see if you continue to improve at the...
I have it on myself, and I have it on others. No, and I should, and that's one of the number one questions I get asked, and it's just one of these kind of practical things. It's like that is yes, that's where we're going. I'd really love to see it. We're moving in that direction. The number one thing we wanted to do to begin with, though, is to adapt this to children. Because most of what we study are child and adolescent disorders, and we think that the default network has heavily been linked to ADHD. We have an interest in ADHD. So we've been moving, currently our first step is to try to move it into kids. The two problems we see with kids are that they probably will not find that task to be that engaging, and that they were going to move along. So we're looking for ways to address both of those things. So I have a supplement to my grant to do that. What we've done is come up with a video game. We call it Mind Run. So coming up with a video game is kind of saying a lot, but if you've ever played Temple Run, the game where you pretty much just go on forever. Well, if you're good enough, you go on forever. If you live in New York, you always, people are playing Mind Run everywhere on the subways and everything else. Or Temple Run, but it's a video game. I have a video. It's a movie of a video game where somebody's running through a maze. Right, and it's one of these games that continues forever. So if your character doesn't die, the same level just keeps continuing and continuing and continuing. And we have a paradigm where if the default network is high, then the movie stops, and if the default network is low, the movie goes forward. And that is, it looks like visually that the character has stopped running through the maze. So the speed that the character runs through the maze is dictated by the level of their default network activity. And then we have a score that we give them, and we tell them that they're either a winner or not a winner based on that score. Everybody wins. But yeah, and that's we hopefully with the score we can handle some of the motivational issues that maybe with ADHD that we have to do, because we can't give them all stimulants all the time.
We have done neurofeedback for over 2 days, and they get about 40 minutes per day in the 4.5-minute blocks. But this is for motor regions, and they do show a trend towards increasing. And then on the second day, some of them have something that looks like offline consolidation. So when they come back in, they do even better when they start out. And some of them start a little bit lower and then increase faster. But I think it's a real big trade-off between them. It's hard. It's like the first task that I've seen people come out of the scanner and be like, well, it was really hard. I'm really tired, because it takes so much effort and they can't actually rest during the rest. So I think that you also see something where it goes up and then it just goes down. Or if you say you have 2 runs left, they just check out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a hard balance to figure out when they've maxed out.
And there's certain confounds, is it just that people are more comfortable in the scanner? by the second time? Is it, so there's things like that. But, to study it rigorously, it's going to require some thought. Another thing I'm interested in, though, that might help with some of these aspects is trying to do it with simultaneous EEG, and then try to come up with classifiers that relate the spatial pattern of the default network to a spectral pattern from the EEG or a spatial pattern from the EEG, something like that allow us to actually use the EEG signal to predict these models and then be able to do something outside the scanner.
So I think they did that. Nice. They've done that in Israel, I think, where they found like what they call an EEG fingerprint of like subcortical activity in the brain, and then they use that for the feedback. And
they probably discovered it at the Brainiac.
Yeah, is that where you talked about it?
No, that's where they stole the name of our. Sorry.
Did you get any subjective reports of people's experience during the more focused versus wandering type?
We have an exit questionnaire where we ask those things. It's kind of hard to figure out what to do with the data, other than help optimize the task further. But analytically, people vary quite a bit. People say that they sing. People say that they quickly think about different colors for the mind wandering, for the focus. Generally, some sort of mental calculation tends to work. Thinking back from 1,000 by 7s, something of that nature tends to work really well for that. But during the wandering, so we leave it very open. So we give them possible solutions for things to do, and then or possible strategies to use, and then we ask them to optimize their strategy based on the feedback. And so we have gotten some interesting ones. One guy, he got in there and he just did it. It just worked. It was like trying to explain it to him. He's like, I got it, dude. He's like, I don't have any more questions. I was like, are you sure? He's like, psh, I got it. And he went in there, bam, 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 perfect, got out, took his money. And I was like, man, you did really good. How'd you do it? He's like, I thought about sex. And at that point, I kind of stopped him right there. I was like, all right. But different strategies seem to work. We haven't done anything systematically to see if some strategies work better than others. I like the fact that the neurofeedback allows personalization of strategies, but it could be that by giving them better starting strategies that we can get the learning curve better when we start looking at training. So we're looking at that. But related to that as well, in terms of if what you meant, like if they say that being in default network high feels differently than being in default network low. That's another interesting thing. Some of the people who do real-time fMRI feedback, they look at, there's one guy in particular named Frank Charnovsky that talks about doing gating a system high or low, and he's using an analogy as like a patch clamp experiment. But the idea is if you ask somebody to say hold their visual cortex high, and then you could do a stimuli and see how the detection probability of the stimuli is affected by holding that brain network high versus holding it low, right? So similarly with this, you could hold the default network high and insult somebody, and hold it low and insult somebody and see if they react differently. So those types of things are possible and are interesting things. You end up with some dual task effects if you're asking somebody to hold the network high and then you're also asking them to be offended when you curse at them, then that may, they may interfere with one another. So that's one aspect to it too. But that's another very interesting aspect, is like, how does it feel when your default network is high?
And what about, have you looked at the data closely enough to have a sense of the time course for the default mode network to kind of come online as a synchronous group of activities, and then kind of dissipate and come back, and how frequently?
So I may have something related to that. So I haven't done doing dynamic analyses, given the few time points we have, is difficult. So caveat with that. One of the analysis we did do, though, is we can actually time lag the labels when we're doing the training. We can time lag the labels with respect to the data. So essentially, I can build a classifier. So what I showed you now is that each TR, you're decoding the default network activity at that TR, right? So when we do that, the time course labels and the training data labels match 1-to-1, right? But what I can do is I can actually switch those. So I increment the time course labels compared to the data. So what I'm predicting at each time point is not the activity of the default network at that time point, but in a future time point, right? So I could decode the default network activity for the next 2 seconds from an image, right? You can actually do that very well. And you can do that well up to maybe about 6, 8 seconds, right? Full hemodynamic delays, there's a lot of slow sluggishness to it, which explains your ability to do that, right? And you can, but what's neat is you look at the spatial patterns that predict it from those, and that pattern kind of does kind of what you're thinking about, where it's farther away, it's smaller, fewer regions, and then it kind of gets beefier as you get closer to the actual time point. Right, if that makes sense. So it seems like there may be 1 or 2 brain regions that hold a lot of information about what the network is going to be like, say, 4 seconds in the future. And then the larger pattern, there's less information about the future and only about the current. Does that make sense, or was that? I feel like I've confused myself. But but I think that helps get to what you're talking about, where you kind of have like the structural cores that kind of bloom out to the full network.
Yeah, it's related to this question I've had for a long time about, the degree to which people's momentary experience is correlated with these purported kind of things that we get by averaging over time in terms of the experience of mind wandering. It doesn't seem like when you're in the midst of mind wandering that it's like coming and going. It's like it just stayed there for minutes. Mm-hmm. But when you look at brain data, that doesn't seem to be what's happening in the default mode. It's actually kind of fluctuating in and out of synchrony with itself.
Yeah, so that creates a lot of interesting questions in my mind. So on a related note, what some people will try to do is they'll build these classifiers. Like I wanted to make a mood ring, an MRI mood ring, where you could essentially track people's emotion during time. So you can imagine, like, so for 10 networks, I could give you an output of the activity of those networks. So instead of it being an abstract thing like the default network, it was actually your sadness. So I could have like a 10-dial display that's like 10 different moods. It's sort of like that Disney movie, but 10 different moods that I could have simultaneously. I could say, okay, at this moment, how depressed are you? At this moment, how depressed are you? Which is actually really cool, because one of the things we can't do is minute-to-minute sampling of mood, right? Because if you ask somebody every 1 second what their mood is, and it takes you 2 seconds to, eventually you'll never end the experiment, right? It'll just go on forever. So you can't get that fine, but if you could objectively measure it separately, it'd be really cool if you could do that, right? And I think that kind of gets to what you're looking at, but in order to be able to train those classifiers, you tend to have to average over a lot of data. So then there's the question of, well, if I show somebody 50 clips and I get them to believe, I induce sadness in those 50 clips, and I have all those averaged together, what does that look like compared to the exact instant when they were sad? And that would kind of dictate our ability to do that. So I kind of saw that one in reverse. But then the other thing we have is the sampling frequency, right? So think about a movie, right? 24 frames per second. So it makes me wonder, like, if you talk about this continuous feeling of being depressed, right? Is that you're depressed, you floor it on depressed, and you're just depressed? Or is it these networks are fluctuating in and out, and because of your sampling, once it gets to, say, 24 frames per second or whatever, it feels like a continuous mood rather than you jamming around, right? Which it could be as well. With some of these things, like you talk about these networks moving quickly versus feeling like it's stable. I wonder if they're moving quickly enough, even though they're switching back and forth, they're moving quickly enough that sort of perceptually to us, it's just one thing and not it fastly going between other things. I think those things are really interesting, but yeah.
And have you looked much at the anti-correlation between the test puzzle networks and
I have a little bit. What you find is, so in the beginning when you have those problems, what I was talking about, the dual task problems, where you got to develop the Jedi mind, in those times you'll actually see positive correlations between networks that should be anti-correlated, and then you'll see them become the expected correlation a little bit after time. So as we played around a little bit with it and haven't found anything too enthralling, maybe that's the right word, with that yet. But a lot of things that we're dealing with, like we talked about, differentiating the ability to turn on versus turn off. Some of the analyses we have to do, they're not clear paths to do, and so we have to figure those out a little bit better. and sort of the anti-correlation, even though maybe it may seem obvious, there are some limitations and problems that we've been experiencing that would make it harder to prove. Anything else? Anybody want to do real-time fMRI now? More than happy to help you. See, y'all know Lee has a lot of experience with real-time fMRI. That's actually kind of how we met. She was interviewing for a postdoc position in a lab that I was a postdoc in, and I asked her, or suggested she not join the lab. Her life has been improved substantially because of that. But much to the annoyance of the person who I was working for at the time, she turned down the job, and then she and I stayed close friends, so you still got to hear about her all the time.